So for these stories on women and marriage in the realist tradition, you're reading Mary Wilkins Freeman's A New England Nun, Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, and then you are watching a performance of Susan Glaspell's Trifles. Now, these texts are an interesting representation of these women's issues, but I want to provide you with a separate context video here for each of the stories because there's some very interesting parallels between the authors and the stories. Now, I want to be clear that these women are not writing about their own experiences or real experience. They're not telling true stories. But the contextual information of these authors and stories is very interesting to consider in terms of how they represent realism. So your first author is Mary Wilkins Freeman. She is a writer from New England. She wrote stories engaging with women's issues. She also wrote stories about spinsterhood, and that's interesting to think about in terms of what this story is, because we actually have, this is your only story where we have an lack of marriage throughout. So Mary Wilkins Freeman did get engaged to a doctor, Dr. Freeman, later on in her life. And due to a series of factors, there was a delay between their engagement and their marriage of about 2 years. Now, after they were married, it seemed like things were okay for a bit. And then their marriage became very tumultuous. Dr. Freeman had a severe alcohol problem, and she eventually had him institutionalized for it. They ended up separating a year after that, and on his death a few years later, he left his massive wealth to his chauffeur and left his former wife $1. So it gives you an idea of how happy that ended. Now, that is interesting to keep in mind in terms of what happens in A New England Nun. Kate Chopin, our second author, you're reading a very, very short story, and one of her most famous, which is The Story of an Hour. Now, in terms of Kate Chopin's background, she was married for a number of years, and she had a very sort of happy marriage. She had 6 children, and she was, by all accounts, completely devoted to her husband. Her husband unexpectedly passed, leaving her with 6 kids, and after her husband passed, she mourned him, severely. However, after her husband passed, she had already sort of fulfilled her social role as wife and mother, and now she was a widow. So the expectations on her to fill that role, she had sort of already checked that box. So later on in her life, after her husband's death, she became known for sort of rejecting, that cult of domesticity at the time. She was known for being, sort of more sexually open than a lot of people at the time. She drank. She wasn't what society would have deemed a woman to be, but she had already done her woman job prior to that. And in terms of The Story of an Hour, that's really interesting to consider how her relationship with marriage changed. So in this story, you do have what is believed to be the death of a husband, and the protagonist's reaction to that is very strong. But one thing I want you to consider as you're reading that is whether the protagonist expected that reaction. A lot of times people have, feel that this is a story of a bad marriage because of the reaction that she has. However, the details in the story certainly suggest that they actually had a pretty positive relationship, which is an interesting example of how even in the best case circumstances, you still have this sort of caging that marriage can create for women at the time. And then your third story is drama. It's a one-act play by Susan Glaspell called Trifles. This was later developed into a short story called A Jury of Her Peers. It's the exact same story, just one's a play and one's a short story, but you're watching a performance of that. And I will link the text for you to follow along as you do. This is an interesting one because it is actually based on a true crime case. So Susan Glaspell was a reporter for the Des Moines Daily News in the early 1900s when there was a murder, the murder of John Hossack. John Hossack was married to Margaret Hossack, and they lived on a farm. And one day, Margaret Hossack wakes up, and her husband has been murdered with an axe in bed next to her. And that is the cause of all of these circumstances. Now, the investigators at the time, Margaret Hossick maintained her innocence. However, she was also not very distraught at her husband's death. Her and John Hossick had a very tumultuous relationship. He was known to be abusive and antisocial. He was also, Margaret Hossick had also said things like, you know, said things to neighbors, etc., about how sort of volatile that he was. Now, when the investigators found out this information, that they had a rough marriage, they saw that as a motive to charge Margaret Hossick with the murder of her husband. She was put on trial, and at that time, women could not serve on juries. She was tried by an all-male jury, and she was not the image of true womanhood that people expected at the time. She, number one, just wasn't very upset at her husband's death. She wasn't the sort of like sweet, pretty, charming woman that society wanted her to be. And her demeanor throughout that trial was something that people reported on a lot. Now, Susan Glaspell was a reporter covering this trial. And at one point during the trial, they invited, you know, the press and reporters to go visit the crime scene, the scene of the murder. And Susan Glaspell noted a number of different things at the Hossick home that hadn't been mentioned in previous reports by the male investigators. Margaret Hossick was convicted of her husband's murder initially, but due to a technicality, that verdict was overturned. In her second trial, the jury couldn't reach a verdict, and she actually never had a third. So, did Margaret Hossick murder her husband? Almost certainly, but she actually ended up living as a free woman for the rest of her life because of that. And this representation in Trifles, if the fictionalized version of it, is looking at the sort of circumstances surrounding a similar situation. The evidence, how men and women perceive the evidence differently because of these gender roles and restrictions of marriage during the period. And it has an interesting outcome in terms of what justice and evidence can end up with.